Welcome to the Southwest Florida Real Estate Update hosted by the York Group of Downing Fry Realty. Our show will bring you the most up-to-date information on the local real estate market, presented by leading experts in the field. Today's guest is Chris Mitchell with Brightway Insurance.
Well, thank you, Chris, for coming on the show. Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about you?
Okay. My name is Chris Mitchell. I'm with Brightway Insurance. I own a couple agencies, one in Fort Myers and one in Naples as well. And, we're independent, so we can write with a little over 100 carriers.
Okay. Let's talk about today, obviously, insurance or homeowners insurance. And the biggest thing when we're selling a property or having a client buy a property, what are the key things we should be looking for, the buyer should be looking for when they're purchasing a property to get insurance?
Well, the biggest thing now that's changed, quite a bit actually over the last 2 to 3 years.
Right.
Some things have changed, but some things remain the same. One of those things that remains the same is the age of the roof. That has actually changed to the perspective of where the roof needs to be a little newer than it used to be. So generally, you've got shingles and tile and metal. You generally want to buy a house with, if at all possible, a roof under 10 years old. But as long as it's under 15 for tile or shingle, you'll have some options. They're just a little bit limited. But what has really changed the last few years is the age of the home, because there are a lot of companies now that do not want to take certain homes when they're older. So you might have a company that says, if a home's older than 10 years, they're not going to insure it at all. You've got some that say if it's older than 20. You've also got some where they actually have got these years that take up certain slots. For example, we'll write a 2015 and newer or a 1987 to 2005. So probably the two biggest things right now are the year the home was built as well as the roof.
So when we're working with buyers, should we talk to you first, which we normally do, and get a price or an estimate or get your input on insurance or what it might cost the buyer?
Yeah, I would advise that. And that's usually what most people will do to get an idea. The other thing, of course, is, with flood insurance. So when you're factoring in the price and if a home's going to be insurable, you absolutely want to find out first before you put in an offer, because, right now with the premiums on the rise, it could be a substantial amount of money.
And so just to summarize that, 10 years, looking at homes that are 10 years or newer, or roofs that are 15 years or newer, right?
Yeah, and the biggest thing, if I had to pick one of those, I would probably say the roof, because obviously you've got a lot of homes that are older than 10 years.
That's right.
As long as the roof is 15, and really 10 is the best, 10 or newer is what you want ideally. But if it's under 15, you've still got some options.
And what are the options over 15 years?
Well, basically, you've got some companies who are now, what they're doing to allow options for customers is they will allow a little older roof, they depreciate the roof itself. So they might say, if you've got an 18-year-old tile roof, we're okay, you can insure it, but understand that if a wind claim occurs, for example, then they'll depreciate that roof. Okay. Or outside of that, you've got Citizens and a handful of carriers, a small handful that'll do, tile roofs up to 20.
So that would be on top of your deductible too when they depreciate it, or how's that work?
Well, your deductible is just directly impacted. Okay, how much damage do you have to your home, and how much does the insurer hold back because of the deductible? If, for example, you had a claim on your roof from hurricane, and the roof was determined it needed to be replaced, they have a roof. Some companies in this situation will have a roof schedule, and they will say, hey, if a tile roof or a metal roof or a shingle roof is 9 years old, here's the percentage that you're getting back. And that's for the roof covering itself generally. So the tiles, not everything else associated with it.
And how about air conditioning and water heaters?
Yeah, air conditioning and water heaters, generally carriers want those to be under 15 years old. There are a lot, especially with water heaters, that will not insure the house if it's older than 15.
And when people are having replacements, just tell our viewers a little bit about they need to get a permit, right? And do a contractor, a licensed contractor?
Yeah, for anything regarding your roof, your electrical systems, your air conditioning, or your plumbing, you absolutely need to have a licensed person in that trade.
Or you won't get credited for that, right?
Well, you might actually be ineligible
Right, and eligible.
Yeah, because if they want to see proof of repairs, and the repairs have to be from a licensed person. So
Are the insurance companies inspecting the roofs after the insurance policy or not?
yes, I mean almost every carrier does external inspections on any single family home. Condos is a little bit different, but yes, they will do an inspection after that to determine, okay, is the inspection that they received accurate, or if it's a newer home where you don't need to buy a separate inspection as the buyer, they still do that inspection.
So let's go to flood insurance. Tell us a little bit about how things have changed in that.
Well, in October of 2021, the National Flood Insurance Program actually changed how their rating system entirely. So it had been the first time in roughly 40 years. So they went from being determined by elevation of the house, the zone, things like that, to, okay, what's the distance to water? What's the square footage of the home? And that's changed it dramatically. So if you're a buyer and you're buying a home, you, number one, want to find out what flood zone it's in, because if you have a mortgage, it's going to be required. And there are some home carriers that also require you to carry flood. But we've seen premiums change dramatically. I mean, for example, in some of the zones where you could always count on something, I say always, 95% of the time, a $500 to $700 premium, now you're seeing several $1,000s a year in a lot of those. Now, one thing you can do on flood is, if the seller of the home has a flood policy, you can actually, number one, either assume or take over that flood policy in most cases, or it can actually help lower the premium of the new policy. So if you're in one of those zones, it's always worth asking if the seller has a flood policy.
And building new homes, what's standards for that with flood insurance?
Well, on the new homes for flood insurance, if the contractor should have hired an engineer to do the elevation certificate for you. And an elevation certificate it typically will help you on newer homes, because they have to be elevated to a certain a foot, determination. But then in addition to that, they usually are elevated a foot or two above. So oftentimes it can help you.
And what has really helped with the insurance companies? A lot of them have gone out of business. So how do we determine what's a good insurance company or not when they're applying for insurance? Because people aren't renewing, or people have gone bankrupt, insurance companies. So,
Yeah.
Give us some guidance for that.
Well, I mean, there are a few different things you can look at. I mean, number one, you can see how many years they've been in business writing in Florida. Because if you've got a carrier that's been here, 15, 20, 30 years, that typically helps you paint that picture. That being said, we've had some carriers in the last couple of years that have been around 15, 20 years, and they've gone out of business. So but that is still an important thing to look at. I mean, you want to look in and see their financial rating. So carriers that are authorized here in Florida have to be A-rated by either rating firm Demotech. There's a couple other ones, AM Best. There's also another one that's kind of coming into the market. So that's good to know. But there's also things underneath that rating that you could go to. Demotech, for example, has some of this, where they'll tell you, okay, what are the assets and liabilities of this company? What has their profitability been, in 2022, 2021? And you can tell if a carrier is losing. I mean, most carriers have been losing money the last several years.
Right.
But there are degrees to that. Some companies have been losing, multiple times more than other companies. And when you see that can be an indication, okay, this company's not going in a good direction.
And we were talking off camera a little bit, but there's some new things coming out with insurance companies. Reciprocals. What's that about?
Basically, a reciprocal is if you are a policyholder, you have a stake in the company. So in other words, they will collect additional fees from you up front. And what that does is that actually builds the company's surplus up. And over the long haul, there have been companies that are around that have been doing that quite a bit. USAA, Erie Insurance, and some other ones. And there's some companies that have modeled this because it proved for actually their financial stability. This actually is very beneficial, because they'll actually build their surplus up to the point where if you have very difficult years like we've been going through, they have additional capital that can actually get them through that. So that is a good thing. I mean, the other thing is, in the event that we've got several years in a row where actually things are looking better, where the company is profiting, they actually will sometimes give you back some money, a refund, so to speak. They'll distribute that back out to policyholders. So there are companies that are moving to this. Not all of them, but there are a handful of them.
And explain to our viewers a little bit about, if there's the rains in California, the flooding in different areas of the world, or earthquakes, how it affects our insurance here. It's not just our hurricanes here, right?
Yeah. So that's called reinsurance.
Mm-hmm.
So every carrier that is domiciled or headquartered in Florida, the state requires them to carry a certain level of reinsurance. And what that is there are, so you have your insurance companies here, for example, in Florida, and then you have your larger insurance companies that provide insurance for around the globe, for companies around the globe. And so what they do is they share in all these disasters. So if we've got a hurricane here, for example, and this same reinsurer covers properties in Japan, okay, those people in Japan actually are also affected by our hurricanes, and vice versa. If there's a tsunami there, we're also affected here.
Right.
Now, clearly, if a hurricane hits here, we're more directly impacted by that.
Mm-hmm.
But these reinsurance companies share all this across the globe. So no matter what's happening where, wildfires, tsunami, hurricanes, everyone's impacted to a certain extent.
And how do you see rates have jumped quite a bit in the last year or two or three?
Yeah.
How do you see them? Are they tapering off? Are they going to come down eventually? Or
Well, that's the hope. I mean, what happened is, so they passed some legislation that went into effect January 1st
right.
of this year.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the hurricanes obviously drive a lot of our premiums, but lawsuits, quite honestly, are an epidemic in our state. We've got about 70% of all the lawsuits in the entire country in Florida against insurance carriers. And so they made some changes that went into effect January that should help that situation quite a bit. And a similar situation was occurring in Texas 25 years ago, and they did these substantial changes and actually turned that market around. And the hope is that these things are going to do that, have that same effect here, but they weren't passed until after Ian. So we're probably not going to see much until next year. And even next year, the hope is that the market will have stabilized and that you'll have more capital coming into the market. So maybe you have new companies popping up, or maybe companies have been reinvested in, so they open up to provide more policies, which that'll create competition, and then hopefully that will drive the premiums down. So I wouldn't expect the premiums to go down this year or next year. Maybe in 2025, based on a lot of calls I've been on, that's the hope, where maybe you'd start seeing, at the very least, the market stabilize, and then hopefully with no hurricanes, if we have a few years of that, hopefully the premiums could come down a little bit.
And the last question is, how long do they have to file a claim from a hurricane? Because they limited that too, right?
Yes, it was when Irma hit, which is 2017.
Right.
There were 3 years to file the claim,
Mm-hmm.
and then in 2021, they
Right.
changed that and they backed that to 2. Well, now in this year, it's now down to 1.
Right.
So you've got 1 year to file the initial claim, and that typically a year, that you have plenty of time to actually discover damage. I mean, certainly it can be months before you figure something out, but that has been passed, and so that should obviously help alleviate some things as well.
Well, Chris, thanks for coming on the show, and I highly recommend, if you have an insurance policy or looking for a new home, to call Chris. He's like an encyclopedia of insurance and represents many different companies. Thank you.
Thanks.